Has Toyota cut corners with the third generation Tundra that came out for 2022? It hasn't been without its issues, and many people are saying they're built nothing like the previous generation. Coming from someone who has owned both, I'll show you all the cost-cutting differences in this new truck, most of which you probably wouldn't notice right away. Stick around until the end. You'll want to know all of this before buying one. And my thoughts on the overall quality will probably surprise you. One of the biggest letdowns in this interior is the center console. It just feels cheap, hard plastic that completely lacks the premium touch you'd expect from a higher end trim level. If this were an SR or a base model, it might be more forgivable, but in a truck that's supposed to compete at the top level, it's a pretty big disappointment. When you compare it to virtually any other truck in the segment, whether it's a Ram, GM, or Ford, they all have solid, well-built center consoles with a high-end look and feel. Most feature soft-touch materials, leather-like upholstery, and a sturdy, well-damped mechanism when opening and closing. Even the previous generation Tundra got this right. That console was rock solid, and when you shut it, it gave off a nice, reassuring thud, something that just made the truck feel more substantial and well-built. This new console, on the other hand, lacks that solidity in every way. The buttons feel flimsy, the sliding tray mechanism has a cheap, almost toy-like feel, and the vinyl upholstery doesn't do much to elevate the experience. Worst of all, many of these consoles develop an annoying, persistent squeak with even the slightest pressure. Toyota knew this was a problem, and they tried to patch it up with some thin, felt padding, but the execution was half-hearted, and it doesn't do much to improve the feel or silence the creaks. For a truck that's supposed to offer a premium interior, this console just doesn't cut it. Toyota nailed so many aspects of the redesign, but cheaping out on such a central touchpoint really drags down the overall experience. If they want to include this console in the SR or maybe even the SR5, that would be understandable, but having it on the higher trim levels just makes the entire interior feel cheap and out of place. Sitting in the rear seat, you'll notice the center console no longer has a convenient pull tab to bring the armrest down. Instead of grabbing a small loop like the previous generation had, you now have to wedge your fingers into the gap and try to pull it down, which is the opposite of intuitive. Once it's down, it's hard to ignore the fact that the center console itself is noticeably shorter than before. While most trucks are making their rear armrest larger, more comfortable, and more functional, this one feels like a step backwards. If the cup holders are in use, there's barely any room left to actually rest your arm, making it feel cramped and less practical. When you go from a larger, more user-friendly design to a smaller one on a newer, more expensive truck, no less, it really makes you question why they determined that was a change that should be made. Another little cost-cutting measure you might not notice right away is in the upholstery, specifically on the back of the seats. If you take a look, you'll see these big, exposed zippers running down both sides of the seat backs. They're pretty hard to miss once you know they're there, and it's not like you're only going to see them when you're riding in the back seat. You can spot them from a mile away. Now, is this a huge deal? Not really, but it's definitely a sign of cost savings, and it's the kind of thing you wouldn't see in a higher-end interior, or even in the last generation of this truck, which wasn't high-end at all, just built well. In fact, when checking out the previous generation Tundra, I couldn't even find a zipper on the seatbacks. If they were there, they must have been really well hidden. This new design makes it obvious that Toyota decided to save just a little bit of money by not bothering to cover them up, as if it would have been expensive to have a little flap there to cover the zipper track. With premium leather, massaging seats, and heating and cooling, it's just odd that they decided to omit such a small flap. It doesn't affect how the seats function or feel, but it does make the truck's interior look a bit less polished and sets this interior apart from the others. For most people, this probably won't be a deal breaker, but once you notice it, you really can't unsee it. If you take a close look at the A-pillars, you'll notice something a little off. The edges aren't cut cleanly. It's almost like there's a little extra sliver of plastic still hanging on, like the machine that stamped it out didn't quite slice through all the way. Instead of a smooth, finished edge, you get this rough, slightly unfinished look that makes it feel like a step backwards in quality. Now, this isn't something you'd typically notice at first glance, especially if you're just checking out the truck in a showroom or a parking lot. But once you're behind the wheel, it's right there in your line of sight every time you drive. It's one of those little details that might not seem like a big deal, but when you compare it to the last generation truck, which had nice, clean cuts, it really makes you wonder what happened here. Did Toyota switch to a different manufacturing process? Did they cut costs on material or production? Whatever the reason, it's just one of those subtle changes that, while not deal-breaking, adds to the overall impression that the interior finish isn't quite as refined as it used to be, or should be. One thing that kinda jumps out as cheap is the door seals on the inside of the front doors. You can see the exterior paint clear as day, not just a little sliver, but a huge gap that makes it pretty obvious. Normally, the door seals would cover that up for a cleaner look, but here, it's just wide open, almost like they forgot to finish the job. It still works properly, and there's no noticeable wind noise or water leaks, but visually, it just looks sloppy. For a truck in this price range, you'd expect them to tighten up that giant gap and make it look a little more polished. To make it worse, the rubber seal is barely hanging on. It's slightly wrinkled and bunched up, like it's too big for the spot. And it doesn't seem like they even used anything to actually secure it to the door frame. It almost looks like it was just wedged in there. Again, not a huge deal, but since it's right there in your face every time you get in or out of the truck, it becomes one of those little annoyances that just keeps nagging at you. This next one isn't really about cutting costs, it's more about saving weight. The metal they're using for the body panels in this new truck seems way thinner than before. One of the easiest places to notice it is in the hood. When you're driving, you can actually see it shimmying a bit, almost flexing as the light reflects on it. When the road isn't perfectly smooth, you might notice a bit of movement, which was not the case at all before. The hood on the old Tundra wouldn't even flex going over railroad tracks. It's not like it's going to fly off or anything, but it definitely doesn't have that rock-solid feel the older models had. I had some paintless dent repair done on my second generation Tundra, and the guy doing the repair was showing me just how thick and sturdy the metal was compared to most other vehicles, which made it less susceptible to dents and dings. You could hear it and feel it. Those panels were built like a tank. This new model, not so much. The metal feels more like what you'd find on most newer trucks, which means it's a little flimsier. It's not like they made the panels thinner for no reason. Lighter panels mean the truck weighs less, which helps with the fuel economy and performance. So yeah, it's probably not just about saving money, but some people find the hood shimmy to be pretty annoying. If you're used to that old school, overbuilt Tundra, this might be something you're going to notice. The paint quality on these black, platinum-specific trim pieces is pretty rough, to be honest. At first glance, it might not stand out, but if you're not looking at it in the most flattering angle, it's pretty obvious. The finish has a noticeable orange peel texture, making the surface look uneven and bumpy instead of smooth and glossy. The paint has this hazy, almost cloudy appearance, which really sticks out when you compare it to the main body panels, which have a good quality finish. Toyota clearly knows how to do it right, but for some reason, that same level of quality didn't make it onto these trim pieces. Maybe it's because they're a thinner plastic, or the paint's just overall lower quality. I'm not sure, but they should be a lot smoother and shinier. Maybe even a dark chrome to match the other trim pieces. It's not just the paint, the trim itself feels pretty inconsistent. If you look closely, you can see slight waves and unevenness along the length of it, making it look a little bit off. For a platinum trim where you'd expect top-tier attention to detail, this kind of fit and finish is definitely disappointing. It really wouldn't take much to get this right, and I'm definitely not the only one to notice it, so it's pretty weird that they haven't fixed it yet. There are a lot of improvements with this generation Tundra, there's no doubt about it. Toyota definitely put more money into different things. One small example is the seals placed around the bed and the cab to reduce drag, whereas the previous model left that area wide open. They made a lot of worthwhile improvements, which makes it all the more puzzling why they didn't follow through on these small, inexpensive details. If we're being honest, I'm being pretty picky here by only pointing out the negatives and basically going around the truck with a clipboard. These are the biggest cuts in quality that I've noticed, and they're all small grievances, which is a good thing in my opinion. I'm familiar with all the new half-ton trucks, and I'm happy with the overall quality of this Tundra, which I've found to be pretty good compared to the other trucks out there. But when I'm really looking for things compared to the last generation, which was built extremely well, these are the ones I came up with.